Well, gang, I'm back. And maybe my hat will give you a hint of what I'm going to talk about today. This is a list front and back of all of the cars I can remember that I've owned during my lifetime. I'm going to tell you the brands, but I'm just going to talk about 3 or 4 that were really special. But Buicks, Packard, Mercury, Plymouth, Corvair, Corvette, Jaguar, Porsches, plural, Corvette, again, plural, Sterling, Nissan, Toyota Tacoma, Volvos, and a Honda. And I'm sure I've missed others because during this lifetime of mine, I had wives, plural, and it was often necessary to provide them with a backpack and an automobile. So I want to pick out 3 or 4 of the cars that were really part of my life. And the reason I'm wearing the Porsche hat will become quite obvious as we go along. As best I can recall, the first automobile that I had custody and control of was a 1940 Buick 4-door sedan. This would have come about in 1949 or 1950, my last 2 years of high school. My grandma Brown, mother's mother, had a habit of buying a new car every other year, and she would give the one that the quote unquote older one to my parents. One of those cars was a 1940 Buick. And I learned to drive in that car, as did my sister, as did my brother. We all went to the same school for many of those years. So the car was crucial in going to, for me, the last 2 years of high school, the first 2 years of college, for my brother, all of high school, for my sister, all of high school. I was allowed to have the car repainted from gray to cream with red pinstripes. And it was a manual shift. In those days, there were only manual shifts. And it was wonderful to have this car. When I left home to go to Knox College in the fall of 1952, my sister inherited the Buick. And when she left for Stanford a year later, my brother inherited the Buick and quickly turned it in on an MGBD. He had he showed a much earlier taste in automobiles than his older brother. A special event occurred in 1950 when I graduated from high school. My father's boss, Frederick R. Kerman, the man who, with others, created the scholarship that sent me to Knox, had a 1940 Packard Coupe with Vogue white wall tires, 6-cylinder engine. That was a puppy of power. And that summer was the summer that I met Kay Risser-Luque, the original love of my life, in many respects probably still is. And this Packard Coupe was a love mobile. It was a great car to neck in. And I just absolutely adored it. My relationship with my first wife, Fern, didn't have automobiles in it, except to the extent that once we started to have children, having one car didn't cut it. And so, much to my father's annoyance, I borrowed something like $10,000 from my mother, every penny of which plus interest I paid back. And I bought what was then a Plymouth station wagon, but it was the appropriate car for a woman with two small children. It wasn't very exciting, and but somewhere after 1964 into 1965, I became acquainted with the service manager of the local Chevrolet dealership. And one day, he showed me a sky blue Corvette Stingray coupe, except that the roof panels would come out. And I drove that car for years from Tamalpais Valley to San Francisco. And the boy's mother, who was achieving increased prominence in the San Francisco television market, didn't particularly enjoy riding in the Corvette, but she found a bubble helmet that she could wear, which she put on that covered her bouffant hair. And so she was agreeable to ride in that car with Scott and Jeffrey in the two seats in the back. There was a big mountain in Mill Valley, California, and the boy's mother would sleep in on weekends because she had to do the evening news in San Francisco. And so I'd take the boys out for breakfast in the Corvette. Then we'd go up to the top of this mountain, and we'd drive down the mountain, and each boy would have, all the way down the mountain, would sit in my lap and steer the Corvette. Then we'd turn around, go back to the top, and come down again with the other boy steering the Corvette. And that instilled in them an incredible love of automobiles. As Fern's prominence in San Francisco television market grew, I became concerned that she needed to have an automobile that would reflect her prominence. So the Corvette license plate, California license plate MLX 513, one of the few license plate numbers I can remember. I turned it in and bought a Jaguar XKE coupe, maroon, automatic transmission, tan leather seats, which I drove to and from the office. And then at the end of the day, she would drive to San Francisco to do the evening news and then to do the late news. The Jaguars in the 1960s and early 1970s were beautiful cars, but they were prone to repeated and annoying electrical failures. So the Jaguar wasn't a particularly popular car in our inventory. And when Fern decided she'd had enough of me and took the boys and went to San Francisco, I had a dilemma. I actually hated the Jaguar. And somehow I ended up in San Jose, California, at a Porsche dealership in which the sales manager had been a sergeant who I served with in the Air Force in Iceland. And I had gotten him out of trouble on several occasions. And I asked him, I said, what do I do with this Jag? I said, it's just not the car for me. And he said, we were having an economic downturn. This is in the early 1970s. And he said, I've had a lot of cars that were bought by Silicon Valley hotshots that have been turned back. And I happened to have a 1970 Porsche 911T Targa. Targa meant that it had a roof panel that you could lift out. But behind the driver's and passenger's seat, there was a steel roll bar that was mounted. So that if you had to ever roll the car, you'd just roll right over. And so I leased the car. It was what they called in the Porsche family, baby shit brown. It was a horrible brown yellow color, thus its name. Ultimately, I had it painted gray. And I must have, and it came time to determine what should the license plate number be. Well, at that time, one of the most popular television shows for young people was Batman. And the Batman television show replicated what you would see in the comic strip. The words would be encased in a little arrow pointing to who was speaking. And so I sat down with Scott and Jeffrey and said, guys, we've got to come up with a unique name for this car. I'd like to have the name be something like the sound that it makes when I blow by somebody at 80, 85 miles an hour. Well, between the three of us, we came up with Whoosh, W-O-O-S-H. I still own that license plate today, and it's been on a variety of cars that I have owned since 1970 until 2021. I displayed the car to my mother, and she said, "Can't you spell, son?" Which the name of the car should be Whoosh, not Whoosh. You left out the H. And indeed, I had. But that was Whoosh, and I drove that Porsche, putting 200,000 miles on it. I had a client, a lovely man, who was on his second wife. He had courted her in a 1973 Porsche 911T Targa. I handled all of his business affairs. I handled his estate when he died of cancer. His wife adored the car, adored the memories of the car, but she just couldn't stand to see it parked in the driveway because it reminded her of her husband. She tried to sell it and wasn't able to. A son born to my client's first marriage came to me and asked me if I would please buy his father's Porsche. And I said, for Christ's sakes, you should have that car. He said, no, I'm single. I don't have any interest in that. So I paid $15,000 and bought this low mileage Porsche 911T Targa that was just in pristine condition. So I sold the original Porsche, transferred the license plate Whoosh to it, and sold the original Porsche and used the proceeds of that to even enhance the restoration of the 1973 Porsche 911T. And I drove it for several years. And one day I got an email from the son of my client. Dear Mr. Small, do you still own my father's car? I've married, I have a son. I want him to know about Porsches. And if by any chance you still have the car, would you sell it back to me? I did have the car. I thought this was the honorable and ethical thing to do. I checked several sources and selected a price. Didn't seek to make a lot of money out of the deal at all, and sold the Porsche. I'm out of cars. I'm out of cars. Well, what happens? I just happened to be wandering through a Corvette dealership, and there's a 2002 Corvette Roadster with two transparent tops, one clear, one smoked, low mileage. And I really drove a deal and got the Corvette and drove it for years. But by that time, I was intimately involved with Mel Walsh, and she didn't like my Corvette. I did. However, happy wife, happy life. So the Corvette disappeared, but I kept the license plate and put it on my Toyota Tacoma pickup. A horrible thing to do to the Hoosh license plate, but I kept it in the family. A few more years go by, and I'm visiting my son Jeffrey in Southern California, and I say to him, son, I gotta have another Porsche. I don't think I can swing it financially. And Jeffrey had inherited a great deal of money from his grandfather, and he said, well, why don't we go halves? We'll buy a Porsche together, and when the weather's good in Nevada County, you drive the Porsche. When the weather's bad, I'll drive it. So we bought a 1995 Corvette 911 Carrera, Cabriolet. Cabriolet was Porsche's name for a convertible. And this Porsche could literally raise the top. It was an actual convertible. So I started driving it. I'm now in my 70s. And I'm hanging out with Porsche owners. I'm going to Porsche rallies. I decide I've got this car. It's supposed to be fabulous, but I've never really driven it hard. So the local Porsche club has an event at a racing track, and I sign up for it. And I take my 1995 Porsche up there, but first I installed a roll bar in it so that if it rolls, and so this makes it really a-okay on the track. And so I go to this course. I'm in the driver's seat. I have an experienced racing driver sitting next to me, and we have earphones on, and we can talk to each other. And he instructs me how to drive this car. So here I am, going down the straightaway at 125 miles an hour. And it comes to a turn, and the guy says, drop it down a gear and slam it. So I hit 130 going through the turn, and it is just fabulous. So I do the same thing again the next year. And I had magnetized numbers that you put on the door, each door of your car. And I chose the number 920. That stood for September 20th, the day that Mary Ellen and I were married in 2003. And so I just loved flying around the track. And so Jeffrey and I continued to swap whoosh back and forth every 6 months. And sometimes Jeffrey would place the tires, which I would pay for, and I paid for the insurance. And but he'd oversee the heavy-duty maintenance, because there were really good Porsche firms in Southern California that he could take the car to. So while I've had this life of lots and lots of automobiles. My whole career, automobile wise, is defined as Corvettes and Porsches. And to those of my children and any grandchildren who may be listening to this message, please encourage your parents to make it possible for you to, if not own a Porsche, at least drive one. It's sure as hell worth the experience. Take care. Love you all. Good day.